About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
And this is Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and anthropology, and through this series of programs I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items and answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. And Noetic is spelled Noetic. Well, it's been over a year since we started this journey of exploring the research of scientists trying to understand what consciousness is and what it does. We've focused on the various models that people have developed to explain our experience and the experiments that have supported those models. We learned that what goes on in the mind is mostly not in our conscious awareness at all, but it goes on in unconscious processes. Our minds, then, can be thought of as having three aspects: what we are aware of, our personal awareness, and what we aren't aware of that's keeping our bodies going, and also includes our fears and beliefs about potential threats and dangers, which we can call the individual subconscious. It also includes what we aren't aware of that enlivens our beings and guides us in our actions, which we can call the individual superconscious. We got those ideas from 100 years ago, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, and it's been validated over and over again. And we learned that we can change our state of consciousness and shift what aspects of mind we are aware of and what we're capable of in the moment, from Charles Tart and others. Then we learned that while it's possible to say where in the brain various processes are active, no one has yet been able to demonstrate where memories are actually stored or what the pathway is by which ideas and thoughts come into form. We also saw that the responses in our body to both our individual mental activity and to what's going on around us happen far faster than nerve impulses or chemicals can travel through the body. So it's clear that who and what we are, our consciousness, and our decisions and choices aren't all originating in the brain. As a result, many scientists have come to accept that what we call mind is not the product of the electrochemical activity of the brain at all, but is in fact the activity of a kind of field that surrounds and permeates the whole body. This field appears to be at least partly electromagnetic because it's possible to measure electromagnetic activity for several feet around the body. So now we can say that the brain is best understood as a receiver-transmitter that receives messages from the field of mind and transmits them to the material body, and receives messages from the senses and transmits them to the rest of the body and to the field we're calling mind. We also learned that the brain modifies whatever it receives from both the senses and the mind to fit past patterns of experience that are stored as hardwired connections among the neurons, following Begg's principle that, quote, neurons that fire together wire together, end quote. And this means that we see and hear and feel what we expect or what we believe we will experience. Experiments that we looked at demonstrated that what we call the individual mind continues to perceive and process for as much as several hours, even when the brain and heart are flatlined and the person has been declared dead, which may be why most reports from those who've been through those experiences do not fit the past patterns of the experiences stored in their brain's neuronal connections. Mind, then, is a field, a pattern of energy that exists during and after the body is functioning as the superconscious, develops with the body and brain as the subconscious, and is being told by the sensory parts of the brain what the world out there is like, our personal awareness. Now, every field has a unique pattern of vibration that makes it different from other fields, and some experiments have demonstrated that people, and some animals, have minds that are vibrating along similar patterns. They resonate with each other and are able to sense when another resonating mind is focusing attention on them or is about to come home. Their bodies change in subtle ways, and some not so subtle ways, when someone they're connected with turns their attention their way, even though they can't be seen or heard. Beyond all that, we've learned that mind affects matter, as demonstrated in the famous double-slit experiments in quantum mechanics, where the subatomic building blocks of the universe, which can show up as energy or matter, whether a mind is present to observe them. And it's also demonstrated in the shifting readouts on random number generators on the network of computers that's run by the Global Consciousness Project in Princeton, New Jersey. Seeing all of this, we're beginning to understand how bodies and environments can shift and change as people change their thought processes, what they're focusing on in the personal awareness part of their consciousness, and we can also understand the effect of mental or spiritual healing and what's called the placebo effect. That is, how the belief of the person in a treatment can help that person who is receiving that treatment experience healing. Because of the nature of fields and because of things like the Global Consciousness Project, a growing number of scientists are seeing our individual field of mind as part of a larger field, a noosphere, a global brain, in Carl Jung's terms, a collective consciousness, and Rupert Sheldrake's a morphogenic field, and more scientists are equating that larger field with the quantum or zero-point field out of which all matter and energy arises in this orderly system we call the universe. It's a field that, as we learned a few weeks ago, Ervin Laszlo calls the Akashic field, using a Sanskrit term for storehouse or collector or holder of the data that is everywhere present from everything that has or ever could happen. Well, based on all of that, the last few weeks we began to explore some of the more popular wonderings about how the mind works, including the way the world around us reflects what we've been focusing on in what's often called the law of attraction, and the way we can access information in that Akashic or quantum or zero-point field through insight, intuition, and the increasingly understood process that is called channeling. Then we began to talk about dreams and the dreaming process, what it does in the body and how it relates to that greater field of consciousness. You can catch up on our past shows on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips, books, and authors that I mentioned. Now, a few weeks ago, we talked a bit about what are called near-death experiences. If you listen to that show, you may recall that the scientist, Sam Parnia, was uncomfortable with near-death experience because he says, we're studying people who have died. This week, I want to integrate what we've been saying about the larger field of consciousness with what we've learned about dreams to talk about what one researcher is calling lucid dying. But before that, I want to invite Dr. Bruce Greyson talking about why scientists are struggling with this material.
In our everyday lives, it seems as if the mind and the brain are the same thing. When you get knocked on the head, you don't think very clearly. When you get drunk, you don't think very clearly. It seems very obvious that the state of our brains affects the state of our thinking, our emotions, our thoughts, our feelings, our desires. And that seems to hold true for much of our daily lives. It doesn't seem to hold true in the extremes. Let me give you an analogy. Henry Stapp this morning talked about Newtonian mechanics, which was accepted for 300 years, 400 years as a description of this wonderful clockwork world we live in, which was perfectly acceptable. And Newtonian mechanics, treating the world as if it's billiard balls, works very well for most of our daily lives. When you throw something up, it falls down all the time. The harder you throw it, the faster it goes. Newtonian mechanics works fine for everyday life. It's only when you get to the extremes of measuring extremely small particles or extremely fast speeds that the Newtonian model breaks down. It's not that Newton was wrong. It's just that the formulas he was using are a limited case. And when you get to the extreme examples, his formulas no longer work, and you need relativity to make the corrections. In normal everyday life, the corrections that relativity adds don't make much of a difference. And Newtonian's formulas are a good approximation. I think the same thing is going on with the brain and the mind. In our everyday life, assuming that the brain and the mind are the same thing works perfectly fine. It's only when you get to the extreme cases, such as when the brain stops functioning, that you see the analogy breaking down. And brain and mind do not seem to be the same thing. The most common example that's talked about now is the near-death experience, where you have people, many people who seem to be clinically dead, a few people who've actually had flat brainwaves documented, who come back saying, not only was I thinking, but I was thinking more clearly than I ever had before. But we also have other examples of cases in which, when the brain is compromised, people think more clearly. There are exceptional cases of people who have irreversible dementia or severe mental illness, who in their dying moments before they die become perfectly lucid. They start recognizing family members, they start talking coherently, they lose their delusions, and then they die. What is that all about? We don't have a materialistic explanation for this. If you assume that mind and brain can separate when the brain starts to deteriorate, then you have an explanation.
So Bruce Greyson says that we can talk about what's going on between the brain and the mind as being an extreme case. Similarly, he talks about how the Newtonian model works with baseballs and rocket ships, but does not work with the very large or the very small. We have to use quantum or relativistic equations, not the Newton equations, to make that understanding clear. He's suggesting that perhaps a whole different kind of study is appropriate at the extremes with regard to the brain and the mind, that we can no longer assume that we can apply materialistic explanations to it. And in fact, he does talk in other places about how trying to or being committed to a materialist explanation tends to move people down a path that doesn't lead them anywhere. Now, this idea that we've been using, that mind and brain are not the same thing, but that mind is a field, part of the field of consciousness in which we exist and of which we are composed, allows us then to consider all kinds of possibilities with how we might approach the dying process. And I thought perhaps you might be interested in hearing what some of the researchers are saying. And I'm going to introduce Jeffrey Long, who has created something that he calls the joy of dying.
I can only describe it like being in a swimming pool, but even my body was filled with this loving. I was one with this place, but also apart from it. It was still me, but I was far more than me. I was one with everything, and it was all good. I heard beautiful music, but it wasn't our music. The music itself was part of me, but it was also much more than me. I felt weightless and free, absolutely free. I was enfolded in this loving, and it was part of it too. There was not one single part of me of anything else that was not love. Individuals did not exist in the same way as we do here. And then she says a few other things, and she says, we are interconnected as one. There is no such thing as death. This experience has changed me. So would you say that this is a typical experience that somebody has?
Good question, Adam. It's a typical detailed near-death experience. We literally have hundreds of near-death experiences that bring up those concepts in a variety of different ways, but all converging down exactly the way you just shared it. In the most recent version of our survey that we have on the website, we asked directly, did you, during your near-death experience, did you encounter any information regarding love? And remarkably, close to half of people checked yes, and went on in the narrative response to describe that type of love exactly like you just shared, Adam, unearthly, profound, all-encompassing, something that is beyond anything that we've ever experienced in our life, any of us. And yet, over and over, times literally hundreds, if not over thousands of times in near-death experiences, I've heard that concept of love expressed. And the fact that it is so unearthly, that it is so all-encompassing beyond anything in their life experience, frankly, is one more line of evidence for the reality of near-death experiences. Same thing with a more difficult concept of unity, connection, oneness. When near-death experiencers describe that, they're much more likely to use the stronger word unity than the weaker word connection. And again, in the most recent version of our survey, we asked directly, during your near-death experience, did you encounter any information or awareness of a mystical connection, unity, or oneness? And again, right about 45% of people answered yes. And with the narrative responses, it was exactly as the near-death experience you shared. In the afterlife, in the near-death experience, they become aware of a unity, a oneness that we obviously are not aware of in our earthly life. It's been amazing to me, literally over 20 years of researching near-death experience, how remarkably consistently that's described. You know, again, here, Adam, is one more example of something that is so outside of our normal earthly life experience, and yet so overwhelmingly, consistently described in near-death experiences, that that's simply one more line of evidence that these near-death experiences are real. They're bringing back consistent observations of something far outside of their earthly life.
The other voice besides Dr. Greyson and besides Jeffrey Long is Adam Aish, and he has a YouTube channel that he calls AISCH Jewish. To understand how we can move through the process of letting go of the body, it helps to understand what most people report having experienced when they let go of their body, when they've been declared clinically dead. And they are describing connection, unity, love beyond conception. Now, if we talk about mind as we have been, and we say that mind is not a function of the brain, is not a function of the body, and is part of a mind field that is across the whole universe, one can imagine how the experience would be immensely different from the experience of being in a body on this planet. One can also imagine that as the mind escapes the limitations of the brain and the body, where our normal thought structure is no longer governing what we can experience of what the mind has to offer, there would be this incredibly free sense, this sense of being able to expand and contract and move in ways one couldn't move in the body. All of these things then are available in what we call the dying process. What's interesting to me is that they're also available in any mystical state of consciousness. It isn't necessary to go through death to have these experiences. It is possible through a variety of techniques that have been made available to us over the years, and we've talked about a few of them on this show, to enter into a state of consciousness which is pure bliss, pure love, pure joy, pure freedom, and a sense of connection and unity with all that exists everywhere. Death is not the only way to have this experience. However, for those whose bodies are, for whatever reason, not able to continue to provide a healthy life on this planet, this is, in fact, something that people can look forward to as they release those bodies. And they can practice ahead of time using the various meditation and occasionally drug-supported, either with psychotropics or other kinds of drugs, methods that help people free their mind from the limitation of the brain. And that leads us to the book that I'm going to talk about today, which is a book called After by Dr. Bruce Greyson, the man that we've been listening to. And the subtitle of this book is A Doctor Explores What Near-Death Experiences Reveal About Life and Beyond. It says the world's leading expert on near-death experiences reveals his journey toward rethinking the nature of death, life, and the continuity of consciousness. Cases of remarkable experiences on the threshold of death have been reported since ancient times and are described today by 10% of people whose hearts stop. The medical world has generally ignored these, dismissing them as tricks of the brain. But after his patients started describing events that he could not just sweep under the rug, Dr. Bruce Greyson began to investigate. Greyson shows how scientific revelations about the dying process can support a theory that dying could be the threshold between one form of consciousness and another, not an ending, but a transition. This new perspective on the nature of death can transform the fear of dying that pervades our culture into a healthy view of it as one more milestone in the course of our lives. It's fun listening to a man who was raised in the sciences begin to have the experience of other kinds of possibilities, and this book does a really good job of that. So the book has a lot of comments on it from various people, and he published this in 2021. It is a new book. It's by St. Martin's Essentials, an imprint of the St. Martin's Publishing Company. The introduction is a journey into uncharted territory. That'll be his own story. And then chapter 1 is a science of the unexplained. And then outside of time, the life review, getting the whole story. How do we know what's real? Out of their bodies or out of their minds? And then going into the biology of dying, the brain at death. And he says unequivocally, the mind is not the brain. He goes on to ask things like heaven or hell, what about God, what does it all mean? And ultimately, he says this is going to modify not only our view of reality, but our lives before death. He gives us some stories with various people who are going through the process or who have gone through the process that we call dying. And he also encounters some folks who might be called mediums who are saying, yes, people continue. I co-founded the International Association for Near-Death Studies, IANDS. And for those who are interested in YouTube, you can find a lot of IANDS YouTubes on their channel. He says, which would serve as an organization to support and promote research into these experiences. For more than a quarter century, I served as the director of research and edited the Journal of Near-Death Studies, the only scholarly journal dedicated to NDE research. A few paragraphs later, he says, what I found in that 45-year journey was a record of NDEs that goes back centuries and encircles the globe. I discovered that NDEs are common and play no favorites. Even neuroscientists have them. And he talks about Eben Alexander, and you probably have heard of his book. A very interesting, relatively new book, After, by Bruce Greyson. Well, if you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments, the show that explores what consciousness is, what it does, and how our lives could be better if we understood it more fully. I'm Ruth Miller, and that sound tells me that we have come to the end of our investigation Normally, I would be looking at what news we could talk about today, but we are out of time. Since we are out of time for today, the next time we get together, we'll look at more of this kind of research to understand what consciousness is, what it really does, and how we can experience our lives very differently when we use the consciousness we have fully. We are out of time for today, but remember, you can continue this exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there is a list of the shows, past shows, and the titles and other resources we refer to on the show, and where you can send me your comments and questions, which I'll do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments, recorded in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon. And have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.